You remember Din Ben Phu? No. The same thing happened in Algeria, in Africa. They didn't have anything but a rifle. The French had all these highly mechanized instruments of warfare, but they put some guerrilla action on them.
Hello and welcome to Guerrilla History, the podcast that acts as a reconnaissance report of global proletarian history and aims to use the lessons of history to analyze the present. I'm one of your co-hosts, Henry Huckmacky, joined as usual by my co-host, Professor Adnan Hussain, historian and director of the School of Religion at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. Hello, Adnan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Henry. It's wonderful to be with you.
It's nice to see you as always, and we have a really great guest and a great conversation planned for today. But before I introduce the guest and the topic for discussion, I'd like to remind the listeners that they can help support the show and allow us to continue making episodes like this by going to patreon.com/Guerrilla History. That's GUERRILLA History. Also noting that Guerrilla History is now also on YouTube. You don't have to actually see Adnan and I on YouTube, but you can listen to us on YouTube if you prefer. Just search for Guerrilla History on YouTube, and you can follow the show on social media. We're on Twitter at Guerrilla_pod, Instagram Guerrilla_history, and we are on our email newsletter, which goes right to your email for free, guerrillahistory.substack.com. Again, Guerrilla has 2 R's in all of those cases. So with that being said, we have, as I mentioned, a terrific guest today. We have Professor Nina Farnia, who is a legal historian and law professor, whose research is about how law is used in imperialism, U.S. law, politics. She has a very interesting book that's coming forth. I'm really, really looking forward to the book, by the way, Professor, which I'm sure I've told you many times, but needless to say, here's another reminder. Professor, how are you doing today? It's nice to have you on the show finally.
Thank you both for having me on. I'm a big fan of your show, so it's an honor to be here with you both.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned, we're both fans of your work, and it hopefully will not be the last time that you're on the show because I have a lot of other conversations that I'd love to have with you. But the topic for today is lawfare. Lawfare is a very interesting topic and something that we bring up in passing in many episodes of Guerrilla History. But I think that as we get into this conversation about lawfare, we first need to define what it is. Many people might hear the word lawfare and just think it's the aggressive use of the law or something along those lines, and less about the structural purpose of it and the structures that propagate it, about how states or corporations are manipulating and creating legal systems to legitimize repression, legitimize the very systems that they stand for. So, Professor, can I turn it over to you, and can you introduce what is lawfare to our listeners?
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to use analogy to start. My introduction to lawfare really was through the Zionists and their prosecution of pro-Palestinian speech or Palestinian activists. And so it's really I would call it a nefarious use of the law to basically prosecute the very worst of, the very worst objectives of state power, right? The most dangerous objectives of state power. I hesitate to use it broadly because the fact of the matter is that in a capitalist society like the one that I live in, the law, by and large, plays a dangerous role. And there are ways to use it to sort of slow it down or to even stop it at points. But ultimately, the law is a dangerous tool in capitalist societies. So lawfare could be that, but what it's most known for is sort of its use in moments of extreme violence to support that violence, to perpetuate it, and to protect the most violent.
Given that sort of role of the law, What are some examples that you could give that, I mean, you mentioned sort of, your first encounter with it as the Zionists. I'm wondering if you can maybe tell us a little bit about some of the ways in which you've seen the law being used to further and advance, Zionist goals. Both in, I don't know if some of the examples that might leap to mind are in the United States context to suppress dissent or to redefine using kind of hate speech and discrimination types of codes for a reverse interest, as it were, to immunize a kind of supremacist and bigoted, suppression of pro-Palestinian rights, or if like one might also kind of think about them in the global context and international law, also within the state of Israel and the way law. I could see like a lot of ways in which your study, as a legal historian and scholar of law and imperialism and its uses, you could probably come up with a lot of examples. I'm wondering what are some of the ones that you think are most illustrative of the complicity and the limits and the dangerous, as you were just saying, dangerous use of the law, in those contexts, for readers to really get a sense, of like what's at stake. Because as Henry was saying, people typically think of the law as a recourse for a justice, or, kind of trying to ensure that there's peace in society, So these kind of naive, kind of official understandings of the law you're countering, and maybe you could give us a little bit of more example and insight into that.
So you're right. People generally view the law as objective, right? It's an objective force that upholds the classical liberal notions of liberty and justice and whatnot. The fact of the matter is that in the US context in particular, uh, the law is designed to uphold property interests and the propertied classes. And so like the National Lawyers Guild, which I'm a member of, which is sort of the left flank of the bar um, in the United States, says, as an organization, we don't uphold property, we uphold human rights. Not property rights, but human rights. There's so many, just as you were talking, there were so many examples that came to mind. Um, but I'll sort of start with one from my book and then sort of bring us to the contemporary moment. The one that I talk about in my book, which involves the targeting of Palestinian and Palestinian solidarity activists, is the Los Angeles 8 case. The book ends with the Palestinian struggle, and in chapter 7 of the book, I focus on that case in particular. Uh, it was called by the FBI at the time the first terrorist prosecution, the first prosecution of terrorists. And these were Palestinian socialists that were being accused of membership in the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is the the socialist Palestinian organization, and which is still active today. And because the Zionists and then the US government argued that it was a communist organization, they were immigrants, and so it was unlawful for them to be in the United States, to have received naturalization or green cards or student visas or whatever. The case lasted for 20 years. Uh, they were initially jailed for 3 weeks in very harsh conditions, but they had a massive movement behind them. They were released, and then they filed their own lawsuit against the government. Every time they won in court, the government would file new charges against them. And so this went on for 20 years. It ended in the late 2000s, like 2007, 2008. Um, it didn't destroy their lives completely, but it hurt them significantly. It was a major hit to the Palestinian movement because a ton of attention and energy was diverted from the actual movement, the cause of Palestinian liberation, to protecting the movement, right? And so that is the duty of any movement, is to protect its people, but it takes energy and resources to do that. And so that was a challenge. and it created the legal architecture for the material support laws. So this is the case that the government prosecuted to create the legal architecture for material support laws, so that you could no longer be a member in quote unquote terrorist organizations. You could no longer advocate for quote unquote terrorist organizations. It was a limit on speech and advocacy. And then, post Al-Aqsa, well, no, actually pre-Al-Aqsa flood, the Zionist organizations were filing lawsuits against organizations like American Muslims for Palestine, National Students for Justice in Palestine, all kinds of Palestinian organizations. And some of these lawsuits, if you look at the initial complaints, I mean, it's like they read like, you know, they're like a mediocre law student wrote them, right? Not even a mediocre lawyer, but a mediocre law student who's distracted wrote these complaints. And ultimately a lot of them have gotten, or some of them have gotten dismissed. But again, it's a drain on resources, it's a drain on energy. And it causes a chilling effect on pro-Palestinian advocacy in the United States. There, as you said, there like after Al-Aqsa flood, there was this is an example in New York where I am. There was a hate crime bill that had a lot of like support. It was and a coalition of Asian American organizations and Jewish American organizations really advanced this bill. Um, it's really a Zionist bill. I mean, that's what it is. That ultimately limits uh, pro-Palestinian speech in New York. That's one example. And then I think the latest and most interesting example is Israel's use of the IAEA, like the International Atomic Energy Association Agency. It's disgusting. I mean, this is as dangerous and horrific as everything I just described is. This is basically bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war, right? Because Grossi came out a couple days before Israel attacked Iran and said Iran is violating the IAEA and the NPT. That gave Israel the pretext to attack Iran. Of course, this is all US orchestrated, right? Like, let's not confuse ourselves or delude ourselves into thinking that this is some sort of, Israel-Iran war. It's not. It's the empire against Iran. Anyways, so Israel attacks on behalf of the United States and Europe, and it escalates to such a point to where the US hits Iranian nuclear facilities. Now, the Iranians are saying they moved everything out, and that there wasn't much damage. The American intelligence apparatus is saying that there was damage, either minimal damage or they caused a couple months of delay or harm to the facilities. And this is good news, right? Because we don't want damage to nuclear facilities because of the potential for fallout. But the fact that this is now okay, that this is slowly being normalized, and that so-called international institutions provided political cover for this, and the head of those institutions provided intelligence to the Israelis for this, this is perhaps the peak of lawfare, right? Where international institutions are now basically responsible for the targeting of nuclear facilities. So what's next? How do we roll this back? What's next? Right? I mean, a lot of thinkers, a lot of our great political scientists, whether we agree with them or not, even the liberals are saying it's virtually impossible to walk this back. Right? And so, I digress kind of, but I would call that an example of lawfare, right? International
Yeah.
institutions providing cover for uh sort of nascent nuclear warfare. Oh, and then on top of that, it just came out today that they were using depleted uranium in Iran. That they dropped the missiles they dropped on Iran had depleted uranium, which is something that we knew about Lebanon as well. So this is all that I just wanted to add that. It's important to add that.
No, I'm glad that you added that. And actually, I think that's an interesting point that you raised because initially, when you discussed the IAEA, I could see it being very analogous to the legal kind of use of the law. But in fact, actually, um, what made me kind of see maybe a deeper symmetry between these processes is that the NPT basically sets out certain conditions, right, for peaceful development, of nuclear energy and other peaceful and commercial, uses of nuclear technology that are, guaranteed by a whole process of inspections and things. And these are, have the force of law because they become part of international law as nations enter into the treaty. And the IAEA is really just an administrative agency for the NPT. And so what it is like the enforcement of the law that is now, been suborned, corrupted, and used. And in fact, the whole use of the IAEA inspection regime, you could say, has been lawfare to prevent the sovereign development of countries, other than those who have already achieved nuclear, weapons technology, to kind of use the law, i.e., this treaty, to prevent others from developing, and the whole way, the cynical way in which the IAEA, has been used for, years and years, to kind of create a sanctions regime on Iran is exactly like lawfare used, against Palestinian solidarity movements to distract, to take energy, to use the mechanisms of the international order, or in the case of Palestinian, activists, the enforcement and, police arms of the state, basically to suppress. So I see a real close connection, and I think it's great that you're making those analogies and connections. But just on this Grossi, I mean, he has been, I think, alarmed by the fact that Iran has really called out, the evidence from presumably the intelligence cache that they got a hold of a couple of months ago, or we don't know when they got a hold of it, but when that they announced that they had, and they've released some small portion of emails and things like that to demonstrate that he's been consulting with, Israel, and adopting their agenda. I mean, we don't know. I don't know if there's been direct evidence of. There's a lot of smoke, but I don't know if there's been direct evidence released or shown of his complicity in providing information and intelligence on Iranian nuclear scientists to Israel and their proxy, groups who have been assassinated. But I mean, I think there are questions to be asked. And in light of that, he has been walking back that statement that, the decision of the IAEA that was announced right before the Israeli attacks commenced, the illegal, preemptive, or not even preemptive, they're just aggressive attacks by Israel. He's walked that back a little bit, saying, well, it wasn't a warrant for war. Well, so why did you release it then 2 days before if you didn't intend it to be somehow justifying or providing some kind of diplomatic cover, lawfare, legal cover under the IAEA? But I think he's worried that, there's he could really be in serious, well, I mean, will he be? No, because,
The Iranian said as much during the
yeah.
because during the sort of peak of the aggression, the Iranians basically said, "We're going to deal with Grossi later." I mean, and so yeah, they use that kind of language, and so it leaves some space to feel, well, what do they mean? Are they going to prosecute him? Are they going to? What intelligence do they have? Right? Was he paid? Is he a committed Zionist loyalist? What is going on here that he is passing intelligence about people's civilians' private lives to the most dangerous genocidal entity in modern history?
Yeah, it's absolutely disgusting, and I'm sure, there will be processes to carry forward, whether they will lead to enough political pressure where there's actual accountability and all of that. I mean, I'm sure he thought there would be absolute impunity. Now he's worried. At least that's something, and I think That's interesting. I did want to come back before I turn things over to Henry for a new question, but just to follow up back on the previous history that you mentioned about what was characterized in the U.S. legal and law enforcement establishment as the first kind of counter-terrorist prosecution, on the, PFLP, the LA aid case. And this, for listeners, is, even well before this is like starting in the 1980s, right? 80s or early 90s. This is even before the very famous Holy Land Foundation case, which is a very analogous one. But what I wanted to point out and just ask you for further thoughts and comment on that is that the legal approach seems quite interesting, especially in light of more recent kinds of attempts to, under the Trump and well, even under the Biden, but under the Trump administration in particular, these attempts to use immigration law to suppress political speech and organization. So this idea that, well, if you're here as a permanent resident or a student on a student visa or here on a work visa, you know, those would not be valid if you were adhering to a political ideology that we've now decided to count as beyond kind of what's allowable retroactively and retrospectively, and then to use kind of foreign policy discretion on the part of the Secretary of State and other things like this to use certain legal provisions and certain legal kind of loopholes within, raison d'etat, kind of national security and this sort of thing, as well as immigration law, where there is much more kind of latitude for the federal kind of executive branch, ICE and Homeland Security and the Immigration and Naturalization Services and so on, to use those to target, and attack certain political positions. And we see that with the Mahmoud Khalil and, all these things that have happened. That's so similar and interesting that it, really goes back to a legal approach since the late 80s, early 90s. And I'm wondering if you have anything more you want to talk about that sort of sphere of the way in which lawfare is used.
So, I would actually take it back much further. I mean, I don't talk about this in the book because I'm a modern historian, right? But in the early 1900s, there was the Sacco and Vanzetti case of Italian anarchists, and they were executed for their activism, their political work. And I would even take it back a little bit further. So after slavery ended, the U.S. had to bring in a bunch of immigrants to replace that free and coerced labor with cheap coerced labor, right? Not as coerced as enslavement, but still somewhat coerced. And these immigrants, all of us, you and I are both among that category, right? Have to be disciplined, right? On the one hand, they need us. I mean, this place cannot survive without immigrants. And
Well, we were just before we started talking a little bit about our connections to the Bay Area, where, the Silicon Valley industry, all these electrical engineers and the computer industry and integrated chips and, all that's developed. I mean, if it wasn't for, foreign born engineers, like, coming and contributing all of that knowledge and education at, like, perhaps lower rates as a result of immigration and recruitment from, like, the global South, like that brain drain that undermined, possibilities of development in the global South, and also at the same time fed high tech for the empire. I mean, that's not possible without these people. So I think that's a great point.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, just on yesterday, I heard on NPR they were saying there's a massive housing shortage in New York, very, very significant. And NPR was reporting that despite the so-called efforts of the state government, the housing construction has slowed down because of deportations. I mean, it's like first of all, like the instrumentality of immigrants to the empire is horrific. But then also the fact that now they're so fascistic that they're willing to get rid of these immigrants and have a bunch of unhoused people, Anyway, so the point is to say that immigrants have to be disciplined, right? We are supposed to be cheap labor and we must stay in line. And so you have, and the same applies to Africans and African descended people. So following the abolition of slavery. So you just have a series of laws, especially in the 1900s, in the 20th century, that completely suppressed speech. A lot of people got deported for their speech. Even there are some examples, and I don't remember who, but they're famous. There are some examples of citizens being deported or being sent out because of their speech. These were communists. So and then we come to this moment where now you have the fall of imperialism. The US is having a massive economic crisis. China is rising, Asia is rising, and the US is becoming more and more fascistic and needs to kick out all these immigrants in order to save face. So to the targeting of Palestinian speech is real. It's honest. It's ideological. It's constitutive. It's related to the empire and the threat that Palestinians pose to the empire. But there is also an instrumentality to it because those laws are used to get rid of a bunch of other people. And so the idea that this is going to stop with Palestinians is ridiculous. It's not going to stop with Palestinians. It's going to continue. In fact, they're getting rid of a bunch of Iranians just this week. They're all of a sudden they're going after Iranians, which, I'm ashamed to say, Iranian Americans are not the most revolutionary bunch, right? In fact, they're the opposite. So they're, borderline fascists by and large. So I'm kind of joking. They're not fascists, but they're not. They tend to be right wing. They tend to support the U.S. a lot. So the attacks on Palestinians they're not going to stay there. They're going to expand dramatically.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we've learned is that the pro-Palestine solidarity movement is being used very effectively as a way to undermine rights, political rights more broadly. Like that's just sort of the sharp end of the wedge, because you can target these groups, but put in place. And I saw this in the UK, for example, the year before when I was on sabbatical there, and I spent a lot of time going to these massive protests in London. And they were called hate marches, and there were a lot of new legislation and new administrative, mechanisms put in place because the specter of all these, even though it wasn't, necessarily majority kind of Muslim people, but they were prominent enough that one could kind of sort of engage the Islamophobic kind of political culture to, exaggerate the panic of, this being, dangerous, having these people exhibit their political views in public political space. That then became the justification for putting in place new legislation to monitor, to surveil, and to suppress. And they would, for good measure, throw in radical, environmental groups within, just to make it seem that it was like, a broader kind of categorical question of public order that required these new emergency kinds of provisions. So I think that's a very important kind of point, is that it's being used in that way. But let me turn things over to Henry.
Yeah, well, my internet is working anyway. Like I told both of you off air, when we have drone threats, the internet gets cut. And so my internet has been very spotty these days, unfortunately. Read into that what you will, listeners. But in any case, I do want to talk about the long history of lawfare. Lawfare reaches back as a colonial tool, as a tool for upholding slavery. Lawfare is not a modern phenomenon. So, of course, we can talk about the way that modern capitalist imperialist states utilize it against radical groups within their countries, like how the United States utilized various codes under conspiracy acts against the Black Panthers, for example. Or we have these material support statutes that you've been talking about, Professor. We have where they've been labeling Stop Cop City protesters as domestic terrorists. We have where they're even finding legal ways of trying to ban BDS, a non-violent expression of supposedly, being able to use our free speech and saying, look, we don't want to send our money to an apartheid genocidal regime. That is now trying to be looked at how to make that illegal. But while we have a tendency to look at all of these modern expressions of lawfare, lawfare does go back and is foundational in many ways to the emergence of a capitalist imperialist system. So can you talk at all about some of those more historical precedents of lawfare in the colonial context, in the context of upholding slavery, etc.? Whatever you want to bring up on that, Professor.
So, Thomas Paine has this great quote that in America, the law is God. And I think that, and God with a capital G, right? So the God. And I think to some extent there's truth to that, where you the the love of law, the upholding of it, the vaunting of it is is a very American phenomenon. It has roots in England and in Europe, but the US has transformed it. Um, and I mean, I think one great example, which I always try to remind our friends in Asia and Africa and Latin America, is are the treaties that the US established with the indigenous nations here. Every time, every time they lost on the battlefield, they would write treaties where they would, not get as much as they wanted, but they would get a lot, right? A lot from the indigenous nations. And then they would break the treaties and continue the war. And so I think we can see that in the modern moment, its counterpart in the modern moment, that period of the treaty negotiations and all that stuff can be used to rebuild, to figure out next steps, continue planning in order to expand the empire. In this case, in the US case, westward. In the old US case, westward. Today, it's to protect what's left of the empire. Um, and so that is a form of lawfare. That's a form of lawfare that's colonial, that helped to create the modern United States. Um, the use of the law to identify Africans as partial humans, right? This was in the founding documents of the United States. That's a form of lawfare. Uh, after the end of slavery, the rise of police forces, the transformation of um, night watches and slave patrols into what we now know as modern police forces that execute the protection of property against Black and Indigenous people. That's a form of lawfare. These are all sort of the use of the law to protect property and protect capital. Uh, and now we're seeing a version of that in sort of ceasefire negotiations in my region of the world. And I say this repeatedly. The same thing happened during the Korean War, where the U.S. used ceasefire negotiations to extend the war and extend the damage it caused against the Korean Peninsula. Uh, in my book, and I found this. I didn't expect to find this, but I found it in the archives. They actually talk about using ceasefire negotiations during the Contra War against Nicaragua in order to dupe the American people. The American people were really rising up against the Contra War. It was a disgusting, disgusting war. Um, I mean, all wars are disgusting, but the Contra War was horrific, and the American people knew about it, knew what their leaders were doing. Um, I found in the Reagan archives at the library in California documentation where very senior Reagan administration officials are saying we need to engage in ceasefire negotiations so that the American people think that we're serious about ending this war. When in fact, like the worst atrocities of the war were happening during those so-called ceasefire negotiations. But those negotiations were cover. They were political cover for those atrocities. And so there is a relationship between the use of policy, which is a form of law, and extreme violence, right? And we should, when we hear the word ceasefire, and I've been saying this over, when we hear the word ceasefire, our alarm should go up these days. That's just like, it's unfortunate, but that's the reality that we're in right now.
And just to add in, when we think about these weaponizations of lawfare, we may tend to think of some of the more egregious examples. And in your examples, you talked about something that happened during the Reagan administration, or right now we're looking at examples that are happening under the Trump administration. But actually, the way that lawfare has been utilized has been successful and has been able to be carried out for centuries because it is bipartisan. In the case of American politics, that is, two parties. Both of the parties engage in weaponization of the law when they're in power, or even if they are in the minority position of government at that time, they still abide by the usage of lawfare. And even in instances where they are opposed to the way that the law is being used in a certain situation, the way in which they engage that application of the law is limited by liberalism. Liberalism is inherently limited when fighting lawfare that has been utilized to construct a capitalist system that is what the liberals themselves had been fighting for. You can't tear down the edifice on which you have built up your system without also questioning the system itself. And that is something that liberalism is incapable of doing because that is the structure that it built itself on. So in the case of the United States, it's bipartisan. Lawfare is bipartisan. And because of it, there is a legitimacy in the weaponization of the law in the case of the United States to uphold these systems. Now, in other capitalist imperialist countries, that's also true, even if they have more than two parties. I mean, Germany, let's look at Germany right now and the way that they are also dealing with protest that's taking place in their country against the genocide in Gaza, or historically against the way that Israel has engaged with the Palestinian people. I mean, we don't just have to draw that there is a continuity between the way that the Nazis weaponized the law to the way that the German state today is still weaponizing the law. The point is that Germany is a modern capitalist imperialist nation, and all of the parties that are present within Germany, and there is many of them, they may disagree with the application of law in individual cases, but by and large, in terms of the structures that are in place, they can't question or they can't challenge the usage of that law for the purposes of upholding that system because they support the upholding of that system. I know there wasn't really a question there, Professor, but I've ranted a bit. Maybe you have something you want to say on that.
No, I think that's a great intervention. You're correct. People in the U.S. I'll touch on Germany a bit. I joked with my students, I think last year, that I just don't understand, like, the Germans, they keep engaging in these genocides just over and over and over again. I mean, setting aside sort of the fact that the globe allows this to continue. Um, why can't the Germans stop themselves? Why haven't they stopped themselves? I mean, do they really want to just keep doing this? At some point, it's going to blow back in a serious way. But the fact of the matter is that Germany is an occupied country. It's occupied by the United States. And so it East Germany, as we know, um, the US had to defeat it. It had to defeat East Germany in its relationship with the Soviet Union. And the way that it has done this is to basically make it a sort of garrison state of some sort, right? Not as severe or as extreme as Israel, but yeah. So the Germans, I think, are a very specific and interesting example, and this partially explains why when the Nicaraguans just filed a genocide lawsuit against Germany in particular, right? Because Germany needs to be stopped, and this is a small way to try to stop it. In terms of the United States, people like like to think they're nostalgic about the Obama era, as if it was. I don't know. I don't know what is going on in people's minds. Um, it was great to see. He's obviously a very charismatic guy. Maybe that's what they remember. I don't know, but but Obama participated in lawfare in perhaps one of the most brilliant ways that we've seen in this century because people continue to be confused about what he did. He um, was the deporter in chief. He deported so many people. I think still his numbers are higher. I actually don't know if his numbers are higher than Biden's numbers. Um, but his numbers are very, very high. It's going to take a lot for the Trump administration, this Trump 2 to get there. He was drone strikes left and right. He killed an American citizen with drone strikes, which I don't think it matters whether they're American or not, but the Americans should at least care, right? Like the people here, the politicians should at least care that this is not a great idea, but he did it. The um the agreement, JCPOA, that he created with Iran, that particular Iranian administration was willing to create that agreement. I was critical of it from the get-go because I knew it was going to blow back on Iran, but it was also a violation of Iranian sovereignty. Why can the US have nuclear weapons but Iran can't? Why can the US and Israel and Russia and China and India have nuclear weapons and the European countries, but but Iran can't? Because nobody wants Iran to be able to defend itself.
Why
That is
why why can't not only can the Europeans have nuclear weapons, but recently they have proposed moving nuclear weapons around between EU states to extend the nuclear umbrella. So it's not that individual states in the EU have nuclear weapons anymore, but France in particular has proposed stationing of nuclear weapons in other EU countries to extend the quote unquote nuclear umbrella. Why is that something that can happen unquestioned? I mean, obviously, it's egregious that Israel can have nuclear weapons and doesn't isn't signed on to any of the nuclear treaties, does not allow nuclear inspectors into the country, and yet which is the country that has its nuclear program struck? It's Iran, not Israel. It's not the country that actually has nuclear weapons within the Middle East. It's the other one that doesn't have nuclear weapons in the Middle East that gets struck as a result of a nuclear program. But I mean, that's an egregious example that everybody knows about, but it wasn't as widely reported as it should have been that France and other European countries said it was a great idea, by the way, but France was the one that was proposing, well, we should shift around some of the EU's nuclear weapons to have more nuclear weapons in more countries of the EU so that our umbrella reaches wider. That is egregious. Why was that not discussed in the news? Why is that not debated in public? Why has that not sparked protests on the streets? It's remarkable, but yet it's something that most people hadn't even heard of because it went underreported. But it's remarkable, Professor.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and when after the Ukraine war began, Gerald Horne, he was probably at that point, the only super prominent American intellectual that was out there on almost a daily basis saying that this is a NATO war on Russia. And we are out of our minds if we think it's a good idea for the Europeans to arm again, especially the Germans at the rate that they're arming right now. And that position continues to be correct, right? Nobody on the planet should agree with the Europeans arming themselves to the extent that they're arming themselves now. And this nuclear umbrella that you're talking about occurring at the same time as Israel attacks Iranian nuclear facilities. This basically takes us many steps closer to nuclear war. And there are people that are talking about it. Even John Mearsheimer, who is a liberal, but very much critical of Israel, but a liberal. Has been sounding this alarm for years. A lot of people have, but the Americans are clear that they are willing to go as far as they possibly can to reap as many resources and pillage as much as they can before their empire falls. And finance capital, global finance capital, has the same position. They will rape and they will pillage as much as they can while they can. And that is what is happening. And if millions of us die at the hands of whatever it is, it appears like so be it, right? I mean, that's the American. But I don't think that's going to happen. It's not going to happen because fortunately we have some states and some entities who are willing to take positions against it. But the American position, I think, is that. And the Europeans are more than happy to be the cannon fodder. They're more than happy to be the cannon fodder.
It's very interesting, like from the perspective of the law and legal regimes, that is meant to be kind of a stabilizing of a liberal kind of paradigm of, imperial capital. But what seems to have happened in the last few years is that attempts to invest perhaps in sort of manipulating and reinforcing or extending that kind of structure and system to the world has sort of fallen apart, and we are in that kind of stage where it's back to kind of plunder, primitive accumulation, and likewise at the same time, we're seeing the emergence and the rise of fascism and fascistic movements in the West that, of course, are the simple corollary domestically to increased kind of colonial imperial intervention, militaristic enforcement of hegemony abroad. And I mean, one thing that has happened in the last few years with the kinds of things we've been discussing up to this point about lawfare is the shredding of the, international legal regime, the so-called rules-based international order, the suborning, as you were just pointing out, even at the very beginning of the conversation, of international institutions that were meant to enforce kind of collective treaties on things like nuclear, tech control. That is all fraying and falling apart. And I think it's for a variety of reasons, because the West is sort of unwilling to kind of invest in the kind of slower process, of extraction and domination that is kind of created by trying to maintain that sort of regime of order and get participation in it. It's been willing to sort of abandon that, throw it aside, sacrifice all of that for the sake of supporting a genocidal apartheid regime in, Israel's genocide in Gaza. But like it's similar to a lot of other, kind of processes, it seems like. And so, one might ask and think about, well, what's the future of the law, as a kind of institution in such a, sort of future. When anything like, the last sort of example domestically that I wanted to bring up because it's so timely and something that again shows what's the problem to this regime is when there is genuine resistance. When resistance builds, it has to throw this all aside because it no longer is capable of managing and controlling, the populations, the global South, others, domestic, dissidents, and so on. And like, for example, Palestine Action, that has used kind of the mechanism of pushing the law, of breaking the law in order to highlight the important higher legal standard of preservation of life, of defending human rights, of the international treaties that, the UK, and even under UK law, that it's supposedly committed to, in order to say, look, trespass and, vandalism and these kind of property crimes are in fact actually supposed to be, under this liberal regime of law, um, subordinate to some higher kind of prevention of the killing, like saving lives. And that's what we're doing. And up to a certain point, they were able to do the damage, kind of inflict costs, and still escape the worst of the kinds of punishment that the legal system, because there was still some investment in maintaining kind of this fiction that, yes, English justice does, have this kind of higher kind of purpose of, and higher values. And juries were willing to kind of, exonerate people because they believed in those values and the law. But that has to be dispensed with now. And so they're being reclassified as a terrorist organization so that law can actually be used for what it's supposed to be able to do, which is prevent, actual resistance. And so that seems to be a case where that just, encapsulates that wider kind of story we've been talking about. But it highlights, I think, this question, or this point, that resistance is what pushes and causes this fraying that we've seen. And that's kind of, in a way, a hopeful thing, that even though there's more suppression, more violent and open suppression, to the point of even dispensing with like law and those systems and norms, that suggests, however, that, resistance is happening, it's working, it's forcing the contradiction. And in that context, so that's what I wanted to ask, is like, in that context, what future the law, like, and should we bemoan it? The end of, on the one hand, we like its protections when we can actually, avail ourselves of them. But on the other hand, the wider kind of situation is that that's only possible when there's enough space for it. And when those, kind of contradictions sharpen, they're ready to throw it all aside. So maybe it's useful that we're achieving the end of illusions, and we just have to have resistance. I don't know. I'm wondering what you think about that.
I want to add on
What future of the law?
I want to add on something to what Adnan was saying in terms of what the future of the law could be like. So, the illusion is gone, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the system can't perpetuate itself in scary new ways. So I'm thinking particularly of new technologies that are being utilized already and are continuing to be developed, such as AI-based surveillance, such as predictive policing. These are methods that could, it once the facade of some sort of fair and just legal system has to be dispensed with, because it has just been violently clear that that's not what the legal system is for so long, that the brutal repression and the repressive tactics that are utilized under the same guise of utilizing the law, using the same lawfare tactics, but with new technologies to be even more efficient, does it make it even more difficult to find ways to deal with the weaponization of the law and continued efforts of lawfare by the structures that utilize them?
It's a lot of questions.
That's what we're good at. We like to load you up.
This is one of the reasons I like your show. So I'm gonna start with the AI question. We're right now, I mean, as we speak, we're learning a lot about the use of AI in warfare, and specifically in West Asia. That's the region that we're learning about the most. Obviously, it's being used everywhere, and especially the United States. But for whatever reason, everybody's attention is focused on West Asia. And I can tell you, just like from anecdotal experience, that the legal academy in the United States is quickly trying to catch up. So a lot of law professors are trying to understand how AI works. They're not people that are schooled or formally educated in technology or engineering or STEM in general, but a lot of the legal academy is trying to figure out how AI works, so that the laws can be designed to address its use. And this is a lot of liberal legal academics in the United States. It's the same case in Europe. in West Asia, a lot of the sort of resistance forces in the region, the leaders of the resistance forces have come out and said that we need to be much more savvy about the way we think about AI and how we defend ourselves against it, but also use it. And Lebanon, I think what happened in Lebanon is perhaps the best example of the violence of AI, the extreme violence of AI. Um, the pager attacks. I'm specifically talking about the pager attacks, and then the bombing of whole neighborhoods in order to take out uh, top Hezbollah leadership like Nasrallah and others. So it's very much on people's minds. I am not of the mind that technology is bad, or that we should be wary of technology, because human society, from the creation of tools in ancient times in the Stone Age, just like basic tools for like cutting and the plow, whatnot. Um, that was technology, and today AI is technology. And we can always, unfortunately, resort to the most base and most violent instincts that human beings have. And that is what capitalism is. That's what capitalism is a reflection of. But the overwhelming majority of us are not like that. By and large, humanity can function well, can function healthily, and can provide shelter and food and safety and education and healthcare for its people when it's committed to doing so. And we actually have living examples of that in Cuba, in China, in the Soviet Union, not so long ago. Strong attempts are being made in Venezuela, Nicaragua, though they're truly under the boot of the US. So if it weren't for imperialism, and this is why we say that imperialism is the primary contradiction, if it weren't for imperialism, the world would be a better place. And we know that for a fact. We know that we have the resources and the mental faculties to marshal all of the inventions that human society has brought to the planet to make the world better. And AI can be used to make the world better. But right now, it's not. So, that's sort of my feeling about technology and AI. I actually have a similar relationship to the law. I'm going to transition now to your question or comment, Adnan. Um, what I tell my students on the law is that at the end of the day, I'm a law professor. I'm not an anarchist. I actually believe in the role of the law, right? In the classroom, there are rules that we use to operate. And those rules are that we respect each other, that nobody, nobody goes and hits anybody they disagree with, or just hit somebody because they feel. Those are rules, right? Like there's social rules that we have. And that's how I view law. That's what law should be. And no matter what kind of society we're in, whether it's an advanced communist society, a socialist society, an Islamist society like Iran, a capitalist society, Republican, Democratic, whatever, there is a legal system. There is a legal framework. Unless you're a pure anarchist, and nobody is, whatever they say to you, nobody is, we have laws and we have rules. And there are ways in which to create a world where law serves humanity. Just as technology should serve humanity, law should serve humanity. That's what the law should be. And we also have living examples of that, right? Cuba is a living example of that, where they have reformed their family code recently. The most recent huge example coming out of Cuba is reforms to their family code. I mean, these are the kinds of models that we should be thinking about and looking to when we're trying to imagine a new world. And I'm going to end with this question with the discussion of China. China is in the process of developing an alternative legal framework to The Hague, and they launched it last month in Hong Kong. It's an alternative arbitration process alternative dispute resolution process that they're focusing on. But we'll see where they plan to take this. But they're quite serious about looking at how to use the law to actually resolve disputes and disagreements in a healthy way, in a way that helps humanity and doesn't resort to extreme violence. So they're a- as as grim as things appear now, right? With the genocide in Palestine, with rising fascism in Europe and North America. The reason these things are happening is because we are at the brink of a new world order that is being led by Asia. And the US is scared. They're shaking in their britches or whatever the thing is that the Americans say. And this is their response. But there is great promise awaiting us, and I actually think it's much closer. This promise is much closer than we think. Prabhat Patnaik, who's a famous South Indian economist, political economist, actually said this in an interview a few months ago. He said that um, all these horrible things that we're seeing now are, uh, one can see them as predictors of great promise, because the people are not going to be able the masses are not going to be able to sustain this level of violence without stopping it. And history has proven that. He said that history has proven that. We saw that after World War II, where uh, Asia and the third world created an architecture to make sure the Holocaust doesn't happen again. That architecture fell apart because of the United States, because the United States at that point was much more powerful, but the US no longer has the economic fundamentals. Just as a basic matter, the US no longer has the economic fundamentals to compete in the way that it did back then. And through resource drain and a variety of other contradictions, it can't destroy the rise of Asia the way it destroyed the rise of communism and socialism.
And this very weakness, and by the way, Professor, thank you for your time. This is going to be the closing question, so feel free to expand as much as you want on this. That very weakness of the system is why I believe that we are seeing and will continue to see even more egregious and open expressions of lawfare. And the reason for that is because, in my estimation, and I'm fairly sure that you'll agree with this, lawfare is an indication of the weakness of the state, of the weakness of the system. Capitalism and states that are predicated on capitalism have inherent weaknesses in them, and they have to utilize tactics in order to perpetuate themselves. Lawfare is one of those tools that they utilize. It's nothing more than a tool, just as when the law is constructed in a way for perpetuating a given system, that is a tool. It's not some legal code that was given to them from above that has some objective truth in it, right? Legal codes are constructed as tools for, in some cases, upholding some sort of order in society, but also for upholding the society itself.
Yeah.
What I then see is that lawfare itself and the usage of it is an indication and almost an acknowledgement that there's a weakness in that system. And as the system continues to weaken itself further and further, and as you mentioned, the United States, as a case in point, is not able to maintain competitive advantages against other countries that it previously had been able to. And so the appeals to international law and violations of international law, or supposed violations of international law by these other countries that it used to way outcompete but no longer can, come more and more frequently. Can you talk about it, whether you see lawfare similarly as an indication of weakness? And given that, as we've both discussed in the last few minutes, that in the case of the United States, which is still the imperial hegemon in the world system, with the weakening of that positioning in the world system, for the United States, do you also see that the weaponization of the law, continued lawfare, is going to only ramp up even further as they try to hold on to the position that they still have at this moment?
Yeah. So this is a really timely question because of what the Trump administration is doing. So fascism, the sort of formal classical definition of fascism is the collapse of the various branches of government under the aegis of the executive. And so what the Trump administration and the far right have orchestrated over the last couple decades, several decades, is the weakening of the congressional branch. This began a long time ago in the 90s. The weakening of the congressional branch, and at to where now that's like completely I mean, it's been completely neutralized, right? Like they don't pass any major legislation that does not uphold the interests of the billionaire class in one form or another, right? They can't even like throw bones, real bones, meaningful bones to the masses anymore. Um, they haven't, this is an interesting case. They haven't passed a single environmental legislation since the early 90s Congress. I mean, that is ridiculous, right? Like, uh, so Congress has been completely neutralized. The far right is now trying to neutralize the judicial branch in the United States. And I think just yesterday or the day before, they announced lawsuits against a bunch of judges uh, who have been trying to push back immigration, Trump's immigration efforts, or at least hold the ground against Trump's immigration efforts. They've arrested judges. They have threatened the judiciary, and they've also packed it over the last couple decades. So I think you're right. I think you're right that the increasing use of lawfare over the last several decades is a reflection of heightened contradictions, capitalist contradictions. But I think there's an open question about what's going to happen with the judicial branch in the United States. If the reality is, whatever we want to say about the Trump administration and the far right in the United States, people like to say they're stupid, this, that. They don't seem so stupid to me. They've been quite successful at executing their fascistic objectives. So they have basically neutralized Congress. I think they may be able to neutralize the judicial branch. I think it's taking a little longer than they wanted, but I think they will successfully do that. At that point, I don't think law is really going to matter that much, because the rule of law was meant to uphold bourgeois democracy. When you transition from bourgeois democracy, I mean, the rule of law in capitalist states, when you transition out of bourgeois democracy into straight fascism run by finance capital, you don't really need the rule of law anymore. All you need is state power and, cops and guns and the military, and that's it. So we'll see. We'll see how long this process takes. We've seen it happen historically, not so long ago. And so far, the blueprint is pretty similar. The blueprint is actually very, very similar to what we saw in Italy and in Germany. So I don't know, but I argue in the articles that I've been writing on fascism and in the talks that I've been given on fascism, that the future is a bit grim for the people living in North America. And law, I think, is going to be less and less important, and the rule of capital is going to really emerge and exploitation. The rule of capital and accumulation and exploitation is really going to emerge as the primary force soon. The clothes will come off, right, as bourgeois democracy falls.
I think that's a great note to end on. Again, listeners, our guest was Professor Nina Farnia, a longtime mutual on Twitter, but first time on the show for you, but hopefully we can get you back on again soon. I know there's a few other topics that we would love to talk with you with, and one that I'm going to propose it now because I know that he also listens to the show. We mentioned off the record at the beginning that it would be possibly fun to have a collaborative episode between you and the Leninist lawyer on law in socialist states and what the law could look like in the communist horizon. I think that would be a really fun conversation. So, listeners, if that's something that you would like to hear as well, let us know on social media. And Leninist lawyer, I know you're probably listening to this because I know he listens to the show. If you're up for that, you can also, you know how to get a hold of me. So, Professor, thanks for coming on. Can you let the listeners know where they can find your work, and particularly where they should be looking for your book? Where is it going to be available?
I got to finish the book. I was actually in the archives yesterday trying to kind of wrap up chapter 1, but it's almost done. The book is almost done. The book.
She's not only in chapter 1, listener. She's going back to chapter 1.
Yeah, I have to rewrite chapter 1. The rest of it is mostly done. So the book is going to come out in 2026, and the rest of my work is on my Albany Law School bio page, so you can find most of it there. But I have a couple of articles coming out actually on the Insurrection Act and the use of martial law in the United States. And then on fascism, I have a 2-part series on fascism coming out. The first part's coming out in the next week or two, and then they'll be posted on my bio page. I want to thank you both very, very much. I really like your show a lot, and so it's an honor to be here. And the dialogue and the questions were excellent, so thank you very much. And keep up the great work.
Oh, it's our pleasure, of course, and we're going to hold you on to coming back on the show then. You don't have any choice at this point. Adnan, can you let the listeners know where they can find you and your other excellent program?
Sure. And I just want to say thank you so much, Nina, for making time to come on the show and share your insight and analysis, and also for the kind words about the work we're doing here. It's really only because we have great guests like you, and so we definitely want to continue to have these kinds of fruitful discussions and hopefully, educate our listeners. You can keep up with me by following me on Twitter at Adnan A. Hussein, Husain. And of course, you can check out my other show, which is a replacement for the Majlis. We've taken it out of like my institutional framework at the university and gone on our own because we don't want to deal with the censorship. So that means, your support for that would be greatly appreciated. It's the Adnan Hussein Show. It's on YouTube and also on audio podcast, and you can support it and support my great, video editor. Video is costly, and I have, a great video editor who Sina Rahmani, who you all know as a host of East as a podcast, another great, online show. So you can support the show at patreon.com/Adnan Hussein, and we look forward to convening with you soon there, as well as here on Guerrilla History.
As for me, listeners, you can find me on Twitter at Huck1995, HUCK1995. I know I've mentioned a couple times that I have another show that'll be starting up very soon called Tsars and Commissars from Rus to Modern Russia, which is a 25-part series on Russian history from pre-state formation all the way to the present. I don't have any episodes up as of yet, but it's not because the episodes aren't ready. YouTube is giving me problems. So listeners, you should be aware that we're done recording through episode 7, and the episodes are upwards of 3 hours long. So you'll get a very good overview of Russian history when YouTube stops giving me problems. But listeners, I'm only mentioning this because if you have experience with YouTube and know how to fix problems with YouTube, get in touch with me on Twitter at Huck1995 because the episodes are ready. I just can't post them. In any case, you can also follow Guerrilla History on Twitter and Instagram, and through our email newsletter. We're on Twitter at Guerrilla_pod, Instagram Guerrilla_history, and you can sign up for our newsletter, guerrillahistory.substack.com. Guerrilla is with 2 R's in all of those cases. And you can help support the show and allow us to continue making episodes like this by going to patreon.com/Guerrilla History. That's GUERRILLA History. So on that note then, listeners, and until next time, solidarity.